Hello, welcome to Susie and Nikki in Conversation. I'm Susie, this is Nikki. Hi, Nikki.
Hello.
Thanks for being back with me again. Nikki and I have got together today to discuss the Panorama program that's hit the headlines massively this week, and caused a fair bit of um, oh, disruption, angst, anxiety in the ADHD community. So it's the Panorama Private ADHD Clinics Exposed. So from the off, a really dramatic, sensationalist title. And Nikki and I are just going to chat about what we found, and our own experiences, and how people might be feeling who have had a diagnosis in these clinics. So if you don't know, if you're watching this and you don't know what I'm talking about, then please have a look at iPlayer on BBC if you're in the UK. Um, and so basically, how can we summarise it, Nikki? It was to expose some private clinics, wasn't it? To
Yeah.
how they're kind of, well, not,
Diagnosing ADHD. It was an expose, wasn't it, on how these private clinics were inaccurately diagnosing ADHD and I guess trying to show how easy it was to get an ADHD diagnosis if you paid privately. That's how it came across to me. Like I mean, I said to you about it, didn't I? Like when we spoke a few days ago, I was just outraged. And I guess we'll talk about our own experiences in a minute, but I was outraged and also really upset because the day after, being in a lot of private groups, Facebook groups with, and seeing the comments and the upset for other people that had ADHD and had been through private diagnosis, and actually with some of those clinics completely spiraling and feeling even more isolated. And I think it's really difficult for people to accept and understand, particularly, like, I don't know about you, but I get a lot, oh, there's no way you've got ADHD, or you don't look like you've got ADHD. The same with autism. And then when you've got a program like this that is so, you know, like a sensationalist title, and it's about controversy, and I just thought it was in really poor taste, with no consideration for an already vulnerable group within society. Like, it just felt like they were wanting people to view it with no regard for the impact on the well-being of those it affected.
yeah. And I think it's given people permission, to those that are already skeptical and like, oh, you can't have ADHD, because when people say that, it's because they don't know what it is and
Yeah.
what it entails. So it's given a lot of people who are skeptical um, permission to be like, oh, see, it's just, it's an everyday, people just need to kind of, work at it. It's not a condition. Look, this is
Yeah.
how easy it is to go and get a diagnosis. So it's a very one-dimensional take on it, wasn't it? Without consideration for the vulnerable group that ADHDers are.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I feel like it's taken things back years in terms of awareness. Just
I
get
mean,
that feeling.
I'd almost say it's made it worse, because if I think you think now about the power of social media and the media as a whole, that that amplifies and magnifies things on a different level. So all the progress that has kind of been made, and people trying to find their space and cope better in a rapidly evolving society, when you've got something that hits the media and social media in that way, I think the damage, in my opinion, is even more vast and far reaching. And you also then get the keyboard warriors that feel like they can, hide behind their screens and put sort of nasty vitriolic comments, which I saw quite a lot of on social media. Um, and there's the impact on people's mental health and the trauma associated with people that maybe did pay for a private assessment. And I think there was there was nothing about ADHD and how it affects people, and how you know, people that do have ADHD, the impact on their lives, and why people go for diagnosis, and actually why are people paying for private diagnosis. So when I was originally referred, I had a letter from my adult health team telling me there was a 4-year wait.
Yeah.
Like, so how about looking at some of that? And there was no examples of private clinics that were doing it really well, but where there were good experiences. And actually, I think a very important message got lost, and that was the danger around medication. So what was horrendous I felt in that documentary was and very valid and very much needed, was that exposure of how easy it was to be prescribed and gain access to drugs. So I think that is extremely valid. And I guess we could talk about our experiences, but I went down a private route, but had an NHS psychiatrist who did private work, with an NHS partner. But I had a full health screening, and I have a heart condition, so stimulant meds were totally off the table for me. So it was really scary to think that had I have gone to one of those clinics, I would have been prescribed potentially life-threatening drugs. And I think that could have been an extremely valid and necessary element of the program.
Yeah.
But for me, that got lost in the distasteful approach of that whole documentary.
Yeah, because that was such a tiny part of it, wasn't it? I mean, it was there and it was like,
Yeah.
wow, no health check or anything. Um, and all I know is that when people are looking at stimulant medication, they have ECGs, they have,
Yeah.
the whole, because of the dangers. So that was, yeah, and that, but yeah, it was lost, wasn't it? The whole tone really suggested, anyone can go and say they've got ADHD. Look at me. They all said I have,
Yeah.
but it was such a small sample. And yeah, what about all those private clinics doing the best they can using NHS partners? And indeed, like you said, why people are going private? Because people can't wait 4 years. The struggle with the deterioration of mental health
Mm.
is people are like, desperate, aren't they? They can't wait 4 years to get help.
No, and I think, my kind of view, and we've talked about this before in terms of ADHD and autism coming under the mental health banner. I always feel like the mental health issue and the anxiety comes as a result of having autism and ADHD, trying to cope and manage in an holistic world, in a world that's not really designed or set out for us. And I think that for many people, if you reach that point that you want help and you're looking for a diagnosis, and maybe that's for medication, or maybe it's for therapy. So I was referred for CBT. So it's not just about medication, but if you're looking for a diagnosis and the ability to understand yourself better, to gain support and access to services that can help you manage your life better, whether that be medication or other therapies, like, that's not a decision that people make lightly, and it tends to not be a decision people make quickly. I certainly didn't. I don't know about you, but from the moment that two people in short succession mentioned that they thought I had ADHD, the research and the rabbit holes and the books I read and all of that was months before I then approached my GP. So it's not that people are just kind of thinking, oh, I might have ADHD, I'll go and pay for an assessment, because
Yeah,
it's expensive for a start. I found it quite traumatic. And I really felt like that documentary like diminished and dismissed all of that. There was no mention of any of that.
so people are not going to know that's the case, and unless they're like us and have been through it. It is traumatic. I spent 5 years
Mm,
researching, also building up courage, because I thought
yeah,
I wouldn't be believed, and oh no, I'm fine, and then the next minute I'm having a meltdown. Maybe I'm not fine. This whole,
roller
so
coaster.
yeah, 5 years I knew before I built. So it's not something people do lightly. You look on the Facebook groups, like people are terrified about going for an assessment.
Yeah, I
It's like,
was.
yeah. And if there are people that are like, oh, I might have ADHD, I'll go and get an, you know, who are they? I've never met any like that. Have you?
Never, like never. And I think it's more a case of maybe even being a little bit in denial. There was nothing exciting for me, or like, oh, I might have ADHD. Let's go and get a diagnosis. It was like, wow, okay, this actually helps me make sense of a lot. I'm
Yeah.
curious about it, like doing some research to almost try and find the evidence that supports that I didn't have ADHD, but everything was coming back kind of confirming that that was likely to be the case. And then obviously, I mean, I was lucky that my mum had kept my school reports, because they were some interesting reading.
What sort
Um,
of things were in your school reports?
oh, things like easily distracted, can do well when she applies herself, not interested at other times, arrogant, but don't think she means to be. I'm also autistic, so there was some of that was tied in with that. Yeah, like easily distracted, too chatty, looking out the window, not paying attention. Um, could apply myself to tasks that I wanted to apply myself to, was difficult if it was a subject that I wasn't interested in. Basically the whole could try harder, must do more. Um, and I was always a bit quirky. I used to cry a lot. So there was, just this, the school reports were like this fairly, yeah, like distracted underachiever, because I wasn't putting in enough effort. I think that probably sums it up. How about
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, same. Easily distracted, chatty, prefers to have a laugh than actually do any work. Um, one that I just love, and I can quote it. Although not a particular behavioural problem herself, her presence acts as a catalyst for the misbehaviour of others. And I know what I was doing because and still am autistic and ADHD. I loved the naughtiness,
Yeah.
of people like messing around, and I loved it. I thrived on it, but I was also very scared of getting into trouble. So what I
Don't
would
break the
do,
rules.
encourage others to do it. So get all the enjoyment. Yeah, I did get into trouble as well, and I wasn't. I was quite. I was always mucking around, and you know,
Yeah.
encouraging some in physics lab. There was this big block of ice, and I said, "Right, let's pick that up and pretend that we've dropped it." And they're like, "Oh, okay then." So we did, and we dropped it. We're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." He's like, "Oh, it's okay, it's okay." But just yeah, so not anything really harmful,
Yeah.
but just having a laugh. And my report suggested that as well. So
And that's where you fly under the radar though, isn't it? Because not not naughty enough, or your behavior isn't significant enough. I still think now, if I was at school now, I did I and I guess this is another issue entirely, but the fact that like autism and ADHD are all geared around um boys, and how clever girls are at sort of mimicking the behaviors that are expected of them and masking and camouflaging their behavior, those subtleties, I still think now I could probably get away with nobody really noticing. They wouldn't understand the effort that I was going to manage all of this internally. But it's, yeah, that's another subject, isn't it, on that point. um
but
but
yeah,
the
people,
fact
yeah.
around this program, like I found it really heartbreaking, and we've talked about this. I also don't know how I would have felt or been triggered if I had had an experience similar to that in the documentary. And I was really fortunate that I didn't, and I had a really positive private assessment. But how I think I would have really, really triggered in with anxiety and panic and confusion and felt very invalidated. It's hard to say, isn't it? Because that wasn't my experience. But what that documentary really lacked as well, I think, is not saying this is what you should expect. These are the private clinics that are doing it really well. Here's how to get in contact with them, or here's how to liaise with your GP or the NHS to choose a partner, a private assessment. And also, what do you do if you have had an assessment with one of these clinics that have been exposed? Because you've like opened Pandora's box for already vulnerable people and
Yeah.
almost shunned their diagnosis.
Yeah, and usually on programs, they say if you have been affected by anything in this program, here's some places for support.
Nothing.
Nothing. And this is the BBC, who you kind of expect more from. Well, I do.
Yeah, and that's where, like, I think that this could have been really positive. And if you look at the comparison between how they've behaved with this documentary and what I thought was wonderful was the Chris Packham Inside Our Autistic Minds. I was like, and that was the BBC, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
BBC
I'm pretty
Two, I
sure.
think that was on. But I'm
Yeah.
like, how incredibly insightful and empathetic and really opened up people's minds to thinking about the experiences of autistics living in an holistic society and not to draw conclusions and assumptions. And I thought that was beautifully done and really powerful and really positive. And then in contrast, you've got this ridiculous, like, I don't even know what the purpose of it was,
Oh,
because for me it was so detrimental in so many ways. I'm appalled at the BBC, to be honest.
yeah. Yeah, it's like why yeah, what was their intention here? Was it to discredit ADHD as a condition?
That's how it
That's
felt.
what it feels like, doesn't it? When you think about the whole 30 minutes, that's what I can't see really what else they were trying to achieve.
There wasn't a purpose, was there? Did you have your ADHD assessment privately?
Mm,
Do you want to talk
yeah.
about, like, because you had and I'll share mine, but like if you share the experience that you had, I think that's really important for people to understand. Not all private ADHD assessments are as that Panorama program
No.
depicted.
No, so mine was with the Learning Assessment and Neurocare Centre. So and they were the psychologist, Dr. Cooley, he was big in the ADHD world. He was just so lovely. And the psychiatrist was somebody that worked for the NHS as well. And
Yeah.
it was hours. I remember being there from like 9 till 12, and it was
Yeah.
very intense. I was being tested for my IQ, for any areas in attention,
Yeah.
working memory, like
Yeah.
trying to get me to hold numbers in my mind whilst doing something else.
Yeah.
I just couldn't. I could hold one piece of information, and he was like, "Really?" So he was shocked at how terrible my working memory was, and it was intense. And in the interview, like my school days, my early childhood, together with some information from my mum, mental health, like
Yeah.
everything. It was intense, and I just assumed that that's what happens elsewhere.
Mm.
But on this documentary, it looked from what they showed, it's probably heavily edited, looked like they were going through the screening questionnaire, like saying, "Do you have trouble sitting still?"
Yeah.
Yes. Tick. Do you have, and that's just the screening questionnaire. That's not basis for a diagnosis. So I think people need to know this. This isn't what happens
Yeah.
and even if people have had a similar experience and been diagnosed with ADHD, it doesn't mean they don't have it.
No.
You know, that's the thing. And I don't want people to be thinking, what if I don't have it now? You know, and feel like a real fraud.
And I think that's the danger, isn't it? And I think I don't think that the screening questionnaire that they were clearly going through, I mean, that was the screening questionnaire that I had to fill out to give to my GP to get referred for an
Yeah.
assessment. But I think I mean, this is where social media is a problem for me. I've seen some celebrities that have filled out that form and have taken photographs of it and said, look, I've got ADHD. And I do everything within my power to stop myself commenting on those posts, because I'm like, that is a tool, you know, it's that is like I don't even know if you'd call it an indicator, but it's a helpful tool to kind of go through, but it isn't your assessment and diagnosis. I think there's two things, isn't there? Because I think I knew after doing all of the research that I did and the reading and the reflection, I knew I had ADHD.
Mm.
And, you know, the choice to go ahead and get a diagnosis is so personal. And I think many people don't go down the route of formal diagnosis, and that is absolutely fine. And if you're self-diagnosed, you're self-diagnosed. If you have gone to a private clinic that was exposed, like you said, it doesn't mean that you're not ADHD just because that clinic was exposed.
Mm.
And the decision to go for an assessment isn't a quick one, is it? You really think
No.
about it and process it. And I was terrified before mine. I'd had to fill in so many questionnaires. I'd had to do so many, like, I'm not good with psychometric you know, the kind of, and I'd had to do some testing, and my brain can't process that type of stuff. And they'd had my school reports and the forms from my mum, and I remember thinking, I don't know what to expect. And my psychiatrist was, and again, it was a really long assessment, and the level of questioning that I had wasn't what I was expecting. I didn't know what to expect, but it wasn't what I was expecting. But it was very situational and recalling right the way back from childhood and examples and questions that, you know, and we've talked about this in other episodes and off of screen. When you're asked a question, we were talking about the queuing, like, you know, what do you do in a queue? I'm like highly irritated and leave most of the time in a huff, that, you know, or I'm really fidgety and agitated and I just want to get to the front of the queue. Things like that, where you don't even know the context or why things like that are being asked. But an assessment isn't the same as a tick questionnaire. They're really assessing. I mean, I had to give all my mental health history. Like,
Yeah.
that was the reality of it, because
And trauma as well. They asked me
yeah,
about trauma because
yeah,
they're looking to see if your symptoms are ADHD, trauma,
yeah,
or both of those things, which
yeah,
is highly common for it to be both,
yeah,
because growing up with undiagnosed ADHD,
yeah,
um, you know, as a consequence, you get trauma with it,
yeah,
don't you? How you
yeah, yeah.
treated, and autism as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always said that so for me personally, I've always believed that my autistic and ADHD traits are my traits, but they've very much been formed by what I've been exposed to, the life that I've led, the environment that I've been in, you know, the interactions that I've had have impacted how it's then affected my life, or the anxiety and the trauma that I've experienced as a result of that, and camouflaging and masking and all that stuff. But I think that I really wish that documentary had touched on, or you know, I wonder if the researchers or the journalists even had any awareness of what it is like to be someone with ADHD living in this holistic society that is just not designed for us, so that it is difficult. The I guess the emotional impact of making a decision to go through an assessment. It's not like a fun at the fair type decision, is it? And the consequences of an expose like that just leaves vulnerable people dismissed, it like invalidated,
Yeah, there was
and
no,
even more marginalized and ostracized. That's how I feel about it. I'm like, and that's how I feel about it without having had that experience.
yeah, and yeah, no care in the world or
No.
consideration for what they were doing. And surely someone along the way must have considered that. I don't know. It feels like there needs to be another follow-up, not necessarily by them, but by someone, doesn't there, to really show
Yeah.
what it's like. I mean, let's put ourselves out there. We'd happily, well, I'm
Yeah.
speaking for you, um, help make a program that's more balanced and shows the truth.
Yeah. And the kind of what it's like to live with ADHD. And I know for both of us we're also autistic, so but what it's like to live um in a society that's not really accepting or designed for us, and the impact that has, and being able to share positive experiences about private clinics. I mean, I went via clinical partners.
Hmm.
I spoke to my GP before I went for assessment, and that was who my GP recommended. My psychiatrist was he was a lovely man. He was an NHS psychiatrist as well. And I think I said to you, it was him that very gently said to me, I believe that you're also autistic. And it was him that referred me for full autism assessment, which I later went on to get through the NHS. And he it was it was a really positive experience in so far as, something that is relatively traumatic to go through could be a positive experience. And I really wish that they had shared that there are some incredible private clinics around.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
in any organization, right, you're going to have some rogue people.
of course.
Of course there's going to be that. It is a very relevant issue that there are these clinics can pop up, and the fact that you had nurses, a pharmacist,
Yeah,
like diagnosing, like that was a worry. And I get that there's a need to raise awareness around it. If it had been positioned as a raising awareness around these private clinics taking advantage of vulnerable
mm,
people, that would have been something else. That would have been these are some things to consider. Like, this is what we've experienced. And the dangers around, prescribing potentially life-threatening or dangerous drugs or unnecessary drugs, exposing people that are being corrupt within their field because they wanted to look after vulnerable people in society. That's another story altogether.
yeah. And
That
they
should have been the
missed,
story.
yeah, they missed that whole part, didn't they?
And they're just angered. I don't know if you saw the backlash online, like
Mm.
the backlash on, like, the closed Facebook groups. And even I think the Mail online had, by the next day, had published something about the uproar.
Yeah,
It wasn't anything particularly in depth, but it was already talking about, the scathing comments around this documentary. Like, just think of what they how irresponsible, how backward thinking and damaging this
yeah.
is. Which, does it just show that there's an even less of an understanding of ADHD than
That
we
sti
thought?
that stigma is still out there, isn't it? It's and they've just kind of contributed to that. It's look, we know what it is. We're living it, we're breathing it, we're working with it to be amazing humans, and that's what we want for
Yeah.
everyone else. So the good thing is it's a very supportive community. So I hope those people that have been affected really badly will reach out and get support and speak to people because they've just been left, haven't they?
Yeah, and do you know what? I don't really know where will they go. That's what the online support groups and the kind of organizations that help, what can they do? Like, I think that's where it's really upsetting, because the people that have been affected, what now? Like you said, like there was nothing about if you had been affected, contact. How do they think that is going to impact mental health within the ADHD community? And this is a different kind of side note, but with what I do in my work with scars and self-injury clients, there is a huge percentage of my clients that are either autistic and or ADHD, and there is a lot of evidence that supports the link between things like self-injury and autism and ADHD. And I just wonder what the impact on mental health is going to be with messages like that coming out of mainstream media. That genuinely really worries me.
Yeah, that's the scary part. I know the charity ADHD UK have done a survey on how it's affected people. I
Right.
looked at their Instagram post earlier, and yeah, massive percentage of people have said it's affected their mental health.
Yeah. And what
Um,
about, we're talking about adults, but what about parents that have taken their kids down this route, like the private route? Because even, I know that with adult services, the wait was 4 years, but with, CAMS and the NHS is so overloaded. So the child sort of support services, whilst it might be quicker, you're still probably looking at 18 months plus. So my goodness, what about the teens and the younger ones that have perhaps had a private diagnosis? I mean, that's just, gosh, that only just crossed my mind. I'd only really processed it for adults,
yeah,
but that's some seriously dangerous territory for mental health, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And Panorama and the BBC need to be held accountable, and that is why people are. I mean, people are writing complaints. They've kind of breached all sorts of their conditions and rules and stuff. So let's see. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah, people are just left to it, and that's not going to change. But yeah, so I guess to finish the conversation, what would you say to somebody that has had a similar experience, a short assessment, because they don't know they just know that's their experience. So if they're thinking now, oh, mine wasn't real, or,
Yeah.
what would you say to them?
I think, first of all, I would say that the documentary doesn't mean that, if you've been down that route or had that experience, it doesn't mean that you don't have ADHD. And actually having an assessment, like I said at the beginning, some people don't have an assessment, they're self-diagnosed. So I'd say to people, please don't let that invalidate your belief or your understanding of your ADHD. The second thing I'd say would be to reach out to either your GP or one of the formal kind of bodies that are able to point you in the direction if you wanted to go for another assessment. I mean, even as I'm saying that, I'm like, is that even the right thing to advise? I don't know. My head is spinning from that documentary. I
It's
think,
hard, yeah.
what would you say? What would you add on
Well,
that?
yeah, I mean, the whole thing, if somebody wanted to go for another assessment, that's going to be a personal thing. Some people
Yeah,
will be, I am, won't they? And
yeah,
some people will
totally.
be, I just think the main thing I want to say is it does not mean if you've had that similar experience, it
No,
doesn't invalidate your
yeah.
your experience. And generally speaking, if
Your
you,
lived experience, isn't it? So you can't.
yeah,
Yeah, that's your lived experience is what tells you whether you have ADHD.
yeah, and once you start like kept meeting up with other people, whether that's online or in person, and you have this spark and this connection, that's because you are part of the same neurotype, don't you? You just know,
Yeah.
and it's an instant thing. So diagnosis or no diagnosis or short diagnosis, it doesn't change who you are, what your
No.
experience is. And if you connect with other ADHDers, then fabulous, you found your people. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has to be that positive message, doesn't it? And I think, I just want to touch on this briefly because they did a bit of a ridiculous expose saying, and even the NHS have been outsourcing. So they really lightly touched on this NHS waitlist. And because of some of the waitlist, even the NHS have been outsourcing to what they were saying is to essentially some of these dodgy
Yeah.
ADHD private practices. And I guess what I would say is if somebody has had that experience, please go back and let your GP know,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the GPs have the choice about who they partner with, and that's different for every local authority. So every single local health authority will make the decision about who they outsource to. It's not a blanket decision. I'm sure that that's right. So if you've had that experience, feed that back to your GP. I would imagine they would likely know. I mean, again, I don't know about you, but I had I don't even know how many pages worth of a report on, on my assessments and everything
Yeah.
that kind of went with that, which was very, so the GPs will likely have an idea if they've got a very, very, light touch.
Yeah.
But I think ask your GP, speak to your GP about your concerns. If it's really important for you to have another assessment, because you need that, not because you need it to feel validated in society, but because you genuinely want to have that experience, I think it's reasonable to ask your GP
Yeah.
to re-refer you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't see why not. Yeah.
Um, but the reason I wanted to mention it is I think it's important that because they touched on that in a very, I think it was I might be wrong, I think it was Glasgow, where they were talking about there was an outsource to a partner and that was a poor experience. But I think it's important that if that is happening, that the NHS know that that's what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully they will now and investigate. But yeah, they didn't show any of the wonderful private clinics. We've had two great, great
Yeah.
experience, positive experiences, and got the help that we needed. And
I
that's
think
what.
it might be worth adding that if somebody really wanted to go for an assessment, and also check with your local authority, because some local authorities might have a 12-month wait or a 6-month wait. Others might have 4 years. Like, my trust had 4 years when I was initially referred, and everybody's going to be different. But what you can do is ask your GP which NHS partners they would recommend. And actually, that is really important, isn't it? That's probably something that we do need to just touch on, just thinking about it quickly, because you need to, if you're going to go for an ADHD assessment, it's important to have an NHS partner so you can go through titration.
Yeah.
So what that means afterwards is shared care agreement. So if, for example, you are prescribed medication, if it's a completely unrecognized ADHD private practitioner, your GP might not accept that diagnosis and therefore might not take on the shared care and therefore prescribe your medication on the NHS,
Yeah.
which could mean you're paying, as we saw in that documentary, hundreds of pounds a month for your medication.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's an NHS partner, typically you would work with the private clinic to stabilise your medication. They would titrate you over to the NHS, and then you would get your medication in some instances by the NHS. I don't take medication, but I think that's quite an important point to
Yeah,
mention.
because some people do get caught out that way and end up
Yeah,
paying hundreds and hundreds. So do your research before
yeah.
and find if you find that research hard, find someone that can help you. That's the thing.
Yeah. Or
So
ask
you
your
can make,
GP, because the GPs will know
yeah,
who they can um who their NHS partners are. So, oh,
yeah.
Susie, you vanished off the screen.
Have I?
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Oh, I can see me. I should.
Oh,
The recording should. hopefully still show me.
Oh, this is weird. I have to have the visual. This is really freaking me out. I can't see
Oh
you.
no. Well,
Um,
let's finish it there. Let me try
yeah.
turning my camera off and turning it on again.
Oh, there you are. Oh, you're back.
Weird.
Very strange.
Freaked you out. You coped well.
I know. Not like when you put up your image as a dog. Do and I didn't cope very well with that, did I? Did
I
you?
was like, oh, this is going to be so funny. I put a dog avatar on, popped on the screen to meet Nikki for, I think it was for a coaching session. I don't know, or a podcast.
It was a coaching session.
And you were like, you didn't know what to say, did you? And then you were like, you do know you're a dog. I was like, yeah, ha ha ha. And you were like, oh,
I
sorry, that
mean,
was
it just
mean.
I wasn't expecting it. I'm not that stuff for me is like I know it was comedy gold for you, but I was very confused by that situation.
And this is like me, like loving the kind of reactions, but yeah, it's a bit mean for other
No,
people.
it was fine. I think I laughed at my own reaction, thinking, "Wow, that's so serious." But my brain couldn't process the fact that you had this dog avatar, and it was just like my brain just got really confused when you vanished off the screen.
Yeah.
I can't do phone calls very easily because I have to see somebody, even though I don't look in the camera that much, but I still have to have a visual,
Yeah.
or my brain gets really scrambled and can't connect.
Wow. And that,
Um,
so many autistic people um have trouble with the phone, and people don't realize, do they, what's going on in the brain, you know?
and I just find it much easier to like to know that I can look, and I know like I said to you before, I was looking at an interview that I'd done with my PA and realizing how much I look around and don't look into the camera. But then I know how difficult it is if it's on the phone or if I can't see someone, my brain can't go, how can you speak to what you can't see? That's what happens for me, I think. So the phone, if somebody says I'll phone you at whatever time, the way around that is I have to walk around, I have to do something. I couldn't sit and talk on the phone because
No,
I can't process it.
really interesting. Good,
Yeah.
good
But
bit of
I think we covered that anyways. It was just the titration, but that's what I wanted to recommend. So if people were really not sure what to do and wanted some guidance, I think the sensible step would be to speak to your GP and ask about NHS partners,
mm,
because then at least you can confidently reach out for an assessment, ask what the wait list is on the NHS, but then confidently reach out to a private clinic that's an NHS partner, knowing that you can titrate and have shared care and potentially get your medication that way, but have that confidence that more often than not, they are NHS psychiatrists that are just doing private work.
yeah, yeah, good advice. Thank you. Well, let's see what happens next. I'm sure there's going to be more on this subject.
Yeah.
Thank you for talking to me today, and I hope that people listening can get some reassurance
Yeah.
and do what's right for them. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
See
you're
you
very
next.
welcome. Thanks for having me on again.